In 1878, Queen Victoria commissioned a palace that no one was supposed to notice. While Windsor glittered with state visits and Balmoral hosted shooting parties, she ordered architects to design something different: a Gothic fortress hidden in 260 acres of Surrey woodland, built to keep one person close: her favorite son, Prince Arthur. The estate cost more than £500,000 in today's money, employed over 100 staff, and contained 120 rooms. Yet for 146 years, Bagshot Park has remained what Victoria intended: invisible. The question is not why she built it. The question is what she was hiding. Chapter 1. The Son Who Could Not Leave. Of Queen Victoria's 9 children, only one was forbidden to pursue the military career he desperately wanted. Prince Arthur William Patrick Albert was born on the 1st of May, 1850, and from that moment he belonged entirely to his mother. Victoria called him her dear boy, her precious Arthur, the child who had inherited Prince Albert's broad forehead and thoughtful eyes. She wrote in her journal that holding Arthur felt like holding Albert himself. This was not metaphor. This was possession. Arthur grew up watching his older brothers leave. Edward went to Cambridge. Alfred joined the Royal Navy at 14. But when Arthur turned 16 and begged to attend the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, Victoria invented a respiratory condition that required him to remain at Windsor. The physicians found nothing wrong. Arthur knew better than to argue. He was 20 when he finally received a commission in the Royal Engineers. Victoria immediately arranged for his regiment to be stationed at Aldershot, exactly 11 miles from Windsor Castle. Close enough for Sunday visits, close enough for her to summon him whenever grief made her inconsolable. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria had transformed mourning into identity. Arthur became her emotional support, her living connection to the husband she had lost. The other children resented it. Princess Alice wrote to her brother Leopold that Arthur lived in a velvet prison and seemed not to notice the bars. But Arthur noticed. He simply understood that his mother's love was the kind that tightened when you pulled away. By 1875, Arthur was 25 years old and had been promoted to captain. His military records show exemplary service. His personal letters show a man suffocating. He wrote to his equerry about feeling curiously restless at Windsor, about wanting to see more of the world than the view from his mother's sitting room window. He never sent these letters. They remained in his desk drawer, unsent confessions that he was not free. Victoria read them anyway. She read all his correspondence. It was one of the ways she showed love. How does love become indistinguishable from control? Perhaps it happens gradually, one small boundary crossed at a time, until the person you love exists only as an extension of your need. Or perhaps it happens all at once, in a moment of grief so profound that you decide one person must bear the weight of your survival. Either way, by 1876, Arthur understood a fundamental truth about his existence. His mother would never willingly let him go. The question was what she would do to keep him. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Loneliness. Victoria did not want Arthur to marry, but when he defied her, she designed his punishment. Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia arrived in London in March 1878 for the social season. She was 26, intelligent, fluent in 4 languages, and accustomed to the political sophistication of the Prussian court. Arthur met her at a dinner hosted by his sister Victoria, the Crown Princess of Prussia. Within 3 weeks, he asked permission to propose. Queen Victoria's response was a masterpiece of controlled fury. She did not forbid the marriage. That would have been too obvious, too cruel. And Victoria prided herself on being neither. Instead, she gave her blessing with conditions so extensive they functioned as punishment. The engagement could proceed, but it would last 18 months. Arthur would remain stationed at Aldershot throughout. The wedding would take place at Windsor under her supervision. And most importantly, Arthur would need an appropriate residence for his new wife. This last condition contained the trap. Victoria began searching for properties in April 1878. She rejected houses near London as too worldly. She rejected estates in Scotland as too far from her reach. She finally selected Bagshot Park, a decaying Georgian mansion in Surrey that sat in the middle of dense woodland, 27 miles from Windsor. The estate had been built in 1798 and abandoned in 1832. Ivy covered the windows. The roof had partially collapsed. It was perfect. She commissioned architects James Knowles and Charles Lee to rebuild it entirely. Her instructions were specific. The new palace must be grand enough to reflect Arthur's status as the third son of the reigning monarch. It must be isolated enough that social visits would require significant effort. And critically, it must be designed so that visitors felt the weight of enclosure from the moment they arrived. Knowles studied the site for 2 months before understanding what Victoria wanted. He positioned the new building deep within the woodland, surrounded by ornamental gardens that created a buffer between the house and the outside world. He designed a central courtyard so that the palace turned inward, its windows facing itself rather than the Surrey countryside beyond. And he specified that all guest bedrooms overlook this interior space, ensuring that anyone who stayed at Bagshot Park woke to walls, not horizons. The plans showed 120 rooms arranged around the courtyard like a cloister, 30 bedrooms for family and guests, drawing rooms, dining rooms, a ballroom, a library, private sitting rooms for Arthur and Louise Margaret that were positioned at opposite ends of the ground floor. The facade would be Scottish baronial style, all turrets and crenellations, and Gothic revival stonework that made the building look simultaneously like a fortress and a fantasy. Victoria approved the designs in June 1878, and construction began immediately. She visited the site 4 times during the first year, walking through the skeleton of the building with Knowles, adjusting the position of doorways and windows with the precision of someone designing a trap. The contradiction was exquisite. She gave Arthur a palace while ensuring that no one, including Arthur himself, could ever truly reach him. Love expressed through architecture, control disguised as generosity. By the time construction finished in 1887, 9 years after it began, Victoria had spent nearly £500,000 in today's currency, building a monument to her refusal to let go. Arthur married Louise Margaret in March 1879, while Bagshot Park was still under construction. They spent their first 2 years of marriage living in a rented townhouse in London, waiting for Victoria's gift to be completed. Louise Margaret wrote letters to her family in Prussia describing her new mother-in-law as uncommonly attentive and curiously present. She did not yet understand that attentiveness was surveillance. She would learn. Chapter 3. What £500,000 bought. The invoice for Bagshot Park arrived in 1887, and the number shocked even the royal treasury, £497,000. In today's money, adjusted for inflation and economic context, approximately $35 million. For a house that was supposed to be a modest wedding gift, a comfortable country residence suitable for a younger son. The figure was staggering. The Treasury requested an itemized breakdown. Victoria refused to provide one. The Crown would pay, as the Crown always paid for her decisions, but the money bought something extraordinary. 120 rooms spread across 4 floors and 3 wings. 30 bedrooms, each with its own dressing room and servant's closet. 8 reception rooms ranging from the intimate morning room that seated 12 to the great hall that could accommodate 200 guests. A ballroom with a sprung dance floor imported from Vienna. A library designed to hold 10,000 volumes. A billiard room paneled in Cuban mahogany. Private sitting rooms for Arthur and Louise Margaret, positioned deliberately at opposite ends of the building so that their daily lives would naturally separate. The kitchen complex alone occupied 22 rooms, larders, sculleries, game rooms, pastry kitchens, a dedicated room for cleaning silver. Below ground, wine cellars stretched for 40 meters with storage for 8,000 bottles. The service corridors formed their own hidden network, allowing staff to move through the house without ever being seen by the family. 143 separate fireplaces required constant attention. 12 bathrooms featured the latest Victorian plumbing technology, ceramic fixtures, hot water heated by a coal-fired boiler that consumed 3 tons of fuel per week in winter. The grounds matched the house in scale and isolation. 260 acres of woodland, formal gardens, a private lake, glass houses for tropical plants, stables for 20 horses, a model farm that was never actually farmed. Stone walls 10 feet high surrounded the entire property, interrupted only by 2 gated entrances manned by lodge keepers who reported all visitors to the main house. And those guest bedrooms, all 18 of them, opened onto the interior courtyard just as Victoria had specified. From the windows, visitors saw only other windows. The view was the house reflecting itself, architecture as mirror, as maze, as trap. No guest at Bagshot Park could wake up and see the Surrey Hills in the distance or the woodland stretching toward London. They saw walls. They understood that they were inside something designed to contain. The staff quarters filled the entire 4th floor. Rooms for the butler, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the valet, the under-butler, 2 footmen, 3 housemaids, 2 kitchen maids, the scullery maid, the laundry maid, the cook, the undercook, the groom, the coachman, the head gardener, and 3 undergardeners. At full operation, Bagshot Park required 107 staff members. This was the minimum needed to maintain basic standards. 1 person for every room used regularly. 5 people to manage the grounds visible from the house alone. Victoria attended the official opening in September 1887. She toured every room, inspected the servant quarters, walked the gardens, and pronounced herself satisfied. She gave Arthur and Louise Margaret a silver tea service as a housewarming gift. Then she announced she would visit for 2 weeks every quarter to ensure they were settling in properly. Arthur was 37 years old. He had been married for 8 years. He finally had a home that belonged to him. And he understood, standing in the great hall with his mother beside him and 120 empty rooms spreading out in all directions, that he would never escape. This was what £500,000 bought. A palace indistinguishable from a prison, a gift that functioned as a life sentence, love made visible in turrets and stone, and windows that looked inward because looking outward was not permitted. The house was complete. The trap was set. But Chapter 4. The rooms no one entered. Within 2 years of completion, 40 of Bagshot's 120 rooms stood permanently empty and unheated. The financial reality arrived with the first winter. Arthur received an allowance from the civil list, the annual income Parliament granted to junior members of the royal family. It amounted to £15,000 per year, a substantial sum for a military officer, a fortune for an ordinary family. But for maintaining a 120-room palace designed to royal standards, it was catastrophically insufficient. The estate manager calculated operating costs in November 1888. Heating the entire house through winter required 12 tons of coal per month at a cost of £360. Feeding and paying 100 staff demanded £9,000 annually. Maintaining the grounds required another £2,000. Routine repairs to a building this size, with this much roof area and this many windows and this much ornamental stonework exposed to weather, consumed at least £1,000 yearly. Insurance, taxes, basic supplies, replacing worn furnishings, hosting the minimal social events expected of a prince, another £3,000. The total exceeded £18,000 before accounting for any extraordinary expenses. Arthur's allowance could not cover basic operations. The deficit appeared immediately and deepened every year. He tried to solve it systematically. First, he reduced staff to 68 people. The undergardeners were dismissed. 2 housemaids left. The scullery maid was not replaced when she married. But a 68-person staff could not effectively maintain a 120-room house. Rooms in the unused wings went undusted. Fireplaces remained unswept. The library developed a smell of mildew because no one had time to air it properly. Then Arthur closed entire sections of the house. The second-floor east wing, containing 12 guest bedrooms, and it was shut off completely. Furniture was covered with dust sheets. Doors were locked. Heat was cut. The ballroom, used once since completion for a dinner honoring Arthur's promotion to colonel, became a storage room for furniture from the closed bedrooms. The billiard room was shuttered after Arthur calculated that keeping it heated for occasional use cost more than his annual wine budget. By 1890, Arthur and Louise Margaret lived in approximately 35 of their 120 rooms. They used 3 reception rooms for daily life and entertaining, the small drawing room, the morning room, and 1 dining room. Their private quarters occupied 12 rooms total. The staff used 18 rooms on the 4th floor. The kitchens operated at half capacity. Everything else stood empty and gathering cold. The humiliation was architectural. Every morning, Arthur walked from his bedroom to the breakfast room, passing locked doors that led to wings he could not afford to use. Every dinner party was hosted in the same small dining room, while the grand state dining room, designed for 50 guests, remained dark and silent on the floor below. Every time a family member visited, Arthur had to explain why certain corridors were closed, why the house felt simultaneously too large and too constrained. Victoria understood precisely what she had done. The palace was a gift Arthur could not refuse and could not afford. Refusing it would have been a public rejection of her generosity, an unthinkable insult. But accepting it meant accepting permanent financial dependence. She had given him not just a house, but a mechanism of control that required no effort on her part. The building itself did the work of keeping him tethered. She offered to help, of course. In 1891, she proposed increasing his allowance by £2,000 annually, enough to heat a few more rooms and restore 1 dismissed gardener. The condition was implicit but clear. The money came with expectations. More visits, more private consultations, more availability when she needed him. Arthur accepted. He had no choice. The alternative was selling Bagshot Park, which would have required Victoria's permission since it was technically Crown property leased to him for life. She would never grant permission. She had spent £500,000 ensuring he stayed exactly where she could reach him. Louise Margaret watched this happen in silence. She had arrived at Bagshot Park expecting a home and discovered a trap that closed more tightly every year. The room she was forbidden to use outnumbered the rooms available to her. The staff she could not afford to employ had been replaced by emptiness and dust. The palace her mother-in-law built with such apparent generosity had become a monument to what generosity looked like when it was actually control. By 1893, visitors to Bagshot Park reported an unsettling atmosphere. The house felt abandoned despite being inhabited. Fires burned in 3 rooms, while 40 rooms stood frozen. Voices echoed in corridors that led nowhere. The architecture designed to contain had begun to consume instead. And Arthur, walking past locked doors every day, and understood that the rooms no one entered were not the empty ones. They were the rooms inside himself that had closed off one by one under the weight of his mother's love. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Disappeared. Princess Louise Margaret arrived at Bagshot Park in 1881 as a confident Prussian aristocrat and vanished entirely from public record. Before her marriage, Louise Margaret had been a presence. Berlin society pages mentioned her attendance at salons and opera premieres. She spoke publicly about education reform and corresponded with progressive thinkers across Europe. Her engagement to Arthur was noted in Prussian newspapers as a diplomatic triumph, a connection between the British and German royal houses that promised continued alliance. Then she moved to Bagshot Park, and the records go silent. Between 1881 and her death in 1923, Louise Margaret appears in official documentation exactly 47 times. Most entries are administrative. The births of her 3 children recorded in the royal registry, her name listed among attendees at mandatory state functions, a brief mention when she accompanied Arthur to the opening of a veterans' hospital in Surrey. She published nothing. She gave no interviews. She left behind no substantial collection of personal letters. Royal biographers writing about the Victorian era struggle to include more than a paragraph about her because there is simply nothing to write. The silence is not accidental. It is architectural. Louise Margaret bore her first child, Princess Margaret Victoria, in January 1882. The birth took place at Bagshot Park with Victoria in attendance, supervising the midwives and physicians Victoria had personally selected. Louise Margaret's mother was not invited from Prussia. Victoria declared that she would serve as both grandmother and guide, ensuring the child was raised properly. She remained at Bagshot Park for 6 weeks after the birth, occupying the largest guest bedroom, directing the nursery arrangements, establishing routines that Louise Margaret was expected to maintain. The second child, Prince Arthur Frederick, arrived in January 1883. Again, Victoria attended. Again, she stayed for weeks, transforming the birth of Louise Margaret's son into an opportunity to demonstrate control. She chose the child's name. She selected his christening gown. She assigned the nursery staff. Now, Louise Margaret's role was to recover and comply. The third child, Princess Victoria Patricia, was born in March 1886. The pattern repeated. Victoria arrived before the labor began and did not leave until the baby was 6 weeks old. By this point, Louise Margaret had learned that childbirth at Bagshot Park meant temporary surrender of authority over her own household. Between births, Louise Margaret existed in the space Victoria's presence allowed. She could not redecorate without approval because Victoria had designed every room. She could not dismiss staff Victoria had appointed. She could not adjust the social calendar without consultation because Victoria expected regular reports on who visited and why. The house was legally Arthur's, but it belonged emotionally and practically to his mother. And servants who worked at Bagshot Park in the 1880s later recalled that Princess Louise Margaret took long walks alone in the woodland. She would leave through the garden door after breakfast and not return for hours. The head gardener reported seeing her standing motionless near the estate boundary walls, looking toward the road that led to London. She never attempted to leave. She simply stood at the edge of her permitted territory and stared at what lay beyond. The walks became longer after 1890. Staff whispered that she was avoiding the house, avoiding her husband, avoiding the weight of living inside someone else's imagination of what her life should be. Arthur noticed but did not comment. Their marriage had become a polite arrangement of separate schedules. He attended military functions. She walked in the woods. They met for dinner in the small dining room and spoke about the children. What happened to the woman who had been confident enough to debate political philosophy in Berlin salons, who had corresponded with intellectuals and attended premieres and existed as a person with public interests and recorded opinions? Did Bagshot Park break her, or did she simply learn that survival required invisibility? The estate offered one form of terrible clarity. There was no point in having opinions about a life you could not control. Louise Margaret could not choose where she lived. She could not determine how her children were raised. She could not escape her mother-in-law's surveillance or her husband's financial dependence or the architectural fact of 120 rooms that should have meant freedom but actually meant isolation. So she stopped leaving evidence. She stopped writing letters that might be read. She stopped expressing preferences that might be overruled. She walked in the woods where no one could observe or record or correct her. And gradually, the public record forgot she existed. By 1900, historians searching for Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia find almost nothing. A woman who should have been a notable figure in the late Victorian royal network simply disappeared into the Surrey woodland, swallowed by a palace designed to make people vanish. The cruelty was not that she was unhappy. The cruelty was that her unhappiness did not matter enough to leave a trace. Chapter 6. When Victoria came to visit. The Queen visited Bagshot Park 17 times in 6 years, and each visit lasted longer than the last. Victoria's first visit occurred in October 1887, 1 month after the house was completed. She arrived with her private secretary, 2 ladies-in-waiting, and her personal physician. She inspected the completed work, verified that her architectural specifications had been followed, and stayed for 4 days. She occupied the master guest suite, the set of rooms specifically designed for royal visitors, positioned on the first floor with direct access to the private family corridors. The second visit, in February 1888, lasted 9 days. The third visit, in July 1888, lasted 2 weeks. By 1890, Victoria was arriving at Bagshot Park for 3-week stays every quarter. She no longer announced these visits as inspections or brief family consultations. She simply informed Arthur when she would arrive, how many staff she would bring, and which rooms she would require prepared. Bagshot Park, the home Arthur could barely afford and could not escape, had become his mother's auxiliary residence. Her presence reorganized the household completely. The daily schedule shifted to accommodate her preferences. Breakfast served at 9 because Victoria disliked eating earlier. Tea at 4:30 in the small drawing room. Dinner at 8, preceded by sherry in the morning room. Arthur was expected to attend all meals and be available for private consultations every afternoon between 2 and 4. These consultations took place in Victoria's sitting room, the one she had claimed during her first visit and which now remained permanently reserved for her use. Louise Margaret was excluded from the afternoon sessions. Victoria would send word through her lady-in-waiting that she required time alone with her son. The message was polite, but absolute. Louise Margaret learned to make herself scarce between 2 and 4, walking in the gardens regardless of weather, visiting the nursery, finding reasons to be anywhere except in the private family corridors where Victoria might see her and be reminded that Arthur belonged to someone else. The consultations covered everything. Victoria reviewed Arthur's military assignments, his correspondence, his social obligations, his financial decisions. She offered advice that functioned as instruction. She expressed concerns that were actually commands. The afternoon sessions were presented as a mother's loving interest in her son's welfare, but they were architectural in their systematic control. Every aspect of Arthur's life was examined, assessed, and adjusted to meet Victoria's standards. Staff reported that Arthur emerged from these sessions looking exhausted. He would return to his study and sit silently for an hour, sometimes longer, before resuming his duties. No one asked what was discussed. Everyone understood that Victoria's love was a force that left people depleted. The most significant moment arrived in November 1890. Victoria announced at dinner on her first evening that she had decided to spend Christmas at Bagshot Park. Not Christmas Day, which traditionally belonged to the extended royal family gathering at Windsor. The entire Christmas season, 3 weeks beginning in mid-December, continuing through New Year, ending when she determined she was ready to leave. Arthur said nothing. Louise Margaret stared at her plate. The children, present for dinner because Victoria wanted to see them, understood only that something important and suffocating had just happened. Victoria spent that Christmas occupying the emotional and physical center of Bagshot Park. She directed the decorations. She planned the menus. She invited guests without consulting Arthur and assigned them rooms in the closed wings, requiring Arthur to heat and staff areas he had shut down to save money. She hosted a New Year's dinner for 60 people and presented it as Arthur's event, though he had neither planned it nor wanted it. She gave gifts to the staff and made them feel grateful to her rather than to their actual employer. And every afternoon at 2, she summoned Arthur to her sitting room and kept him there until 4. By the time Victoria left in early January 1891, Arthur understood several truths completely. First, Bagshot Park was not actually his. It was Victoria's extension, her territory, her property, despite the legal documents that said otherwise. Second, his marriage existed only in the spaces Victoria did not occupy, which meant it barely existed at all. Third, there would be no escape while she lived. The palace she had built to keep him close was functioning exactly as designed. The visits continued. 17 documented stays between 1887 and 1893, each lasting between 1 week and 3 weeks. After 1893, Victoria visited less frequently, her age and declining health making travel difficult. But the pattern was established. Bagshot Park belonged to her. Arthur lived there with permission. Louise Margaret stopped attending formal dinners when Victoria visited. She claimed headaches, fatigue, the demands of managing 3 young children. No one questioned these excuses. They were transparent and necessary. She had learned that the only way to maintain any autonomy was to become invisible when her mother-in-law arrived. Arthur never objected to the visits, never suggested they were too frequent or too long, never asked his mother to give advance notice or limit her stay. He had spent his entire life inside her gravity, and by 40, he no longer knew how to exist outside it. The palace was a physical manifestation of what he had always been: the son who could not leave, the favorite who was never free, the person whose purpose was to absorb his mother's need. Victoria died in January 1901 at Osborne House, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had been summoned to her bedside. Arthur was there. He held her hand as she died, and then he returned to Bagshot Park and waited for freedom that never came. Chapter 7. The Death That Changed Nothing. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and Arthur waited for freedom that never arrived. The news reached Bagshot Park on the evening of the 22nd of January. Arthur was 50 years old, a decorated military officer, a husband, a father. He had spent 2 decades living inside the palace his mother built specifically to keep him tethered. Her death should have meant release. It meant nothing of the kind. The first problem was practical. Bagshot Park was not Arthur's property. It was Crown estate land leased to him for life under terms Victoria had negotiated with the Treasury in 1878. He could not sell it. He could not transfer it. He could not even sublet rooms without Crown permission. The palace was his to inhabit, but not to escape. The second problem was financial. His allowance from the civil list, £15,000 annually, had been insufficient when Victoria was alive. Her death did not increase it. He now faced a choice between maintaining the full estate at a loss that deepened yearly, or closing more wings and accepting that his mother's gift would continue shrinking around him. The third problem was psychological. Arthur had lived according to Victoria's expectations for 50 years. She had shaped his daily routines, his social calendar, his military assignments, his understanding of duty. Without her demands structuring his time, he discovered he did not know what he actually wanted. Freedom requires knowing what to do with it. Arthur had no practice. He tried to adjust. In March 1901, he requested a transfer to London, hoping to be stationed at Horse Guards Parade, where he could maintain a townhouse and visit Bagshot Park occasionally, rather than living there permanently. The War Office approved the transfer. Arthur began searching for London properties he could afford. Then he received the accounting. To maintain even a minimal presence at Bagshot Park while living primarily in London would require staff in both locations, doubled household expenses, and at least £8,000 additional pounds per year. He could not afford it. He cancelled the London search. He tried reducing the estate operations further. By 1903, staff had been cut to 42 people. The East Wing was permanently closed, all 3 floors sealed off. The ballroom was locked. The state dining room was shuttered. The library was opened once per month to prevent complete deterioration. Arthur and Louise Margaret used exactly 20 rooms regularly. 100 rooms stood empty. Visitors who came to Bagshot Park in the early 1900s reported an atmosphere of decay disguised as occupied residence. Fires burned in 3 rooms while the rest of the house gathered cold. Dust sheets covered furniture in corridors that were theoretically still in use. The gardens, once maintained by 8 gardeners, were now tended by 2 elderly men who could barely keep the main lawn presentable. The woodland had begun reclaiming the formal borders, ivy and brambles advancing toward the house, and Arthur walked through it every day. A 50-something military officer living in a palace that was slowly consuming itself, unable to leave because leaving would require resources he did not have and decisions he did not know how to make. Louise Margaret aged into silence beside him. Her long walks in the woodland continued and now extended to entire afternoons. Staff rarely saw her. She took meals in her private sitting room rather than joining Arthur in the dining room. They had been married 22 years and had become strangers who shared the same decaying estate. The cruelest part was this. Arthur could have written to the Crown and requested permission to relinquish Bagshot Park. He could have explained the financial impossibility, the unsustainable costs, the reality that maintaining even a fraction of the estate exceeded his means. The Crown would likely have agreed, found him a smaller property, released him from the burden. He never asked, because asking would have meant admitting that Victoria's gift was a failure, that her grand gesture of maternal love had been nothing more than an expensive trap, that the palace she built to keep him close had actually isolated him completely. Asking would have required acknowledging that his mother, whom he had spent his life trying to please, had hurt him. Arthur could not make that acknowledgement, so he stayed. By 1910, he had been living at Bagshot Park for 23 years. Victoria had been dead for 9. The house continued its slow collapse. More rooms closed, more staff dismissed, more bills arriving that could not be paid in full. Arthur developed gout and spent weeks confined to his bedroom, looking out at the interior courtyard his mother had designed specifically to prevent him from seeing horizons. He understood by then what had happened. Victoria's death had not freed him because the prison was not Victoria herself. The prison was his inability to imagine life outside her architecture, his failure to develop any identity separate from being her favorite son, his complete absorption into the role she had assigned him. The palace was Victoria's final and most perfect exercise of control. She did not need to be alive for it to function. The walls continued doing the work she had started, and Arthur, wealthy enough to afford a palace but too poor to maintain it, too dutiful to abandon it, too damaged to escape it, remained exactly where she had always wanted him, close, contained, and slowly disappearing into the rooms no one entered. Chapter 8. The silence deepens. Between 1901 and Arthur's death in 1942, Bagshot Park hosted exactly 4 documented social events. The first was Princess Margaret Victoria's wedding in 1905. Arthur's eldest daughter married at Bagshot Park in a ceremony attended by 80 guests, the last time the estate functioned as a proper royal residence. The ballroom was opened and cleaned. The state dining room was prepared for the wedding breakfast. Staff was temporarily increased to 60 people to manage the event. For 3 days, Bagshot Park operated as Victoria had intended, a palace capable of hosting significant occasions. Then the guests left. The ballroom was locked again. The state dining room was shuttered. Staff returned to the reduced number Arthur could afford. The house resumed its slow contraction. The second event was Arthur's promotion to Field Marshal in 1919, celebrated with a small reception for 40 military colleagues. They gathered in the morning room because it was the only reception space kept heated consistently. Guests later commented on the unsettling quiet of the estate, the sense of walking through a building that had given up on being inhabited. The third event was Princess Victoria Patricia's visit in 1924, returning with her husband and children for a weekend. The visit lasted 3 days. Victoria Patricia later wrote to her brother that Bagshot Park felt frozen in time, not preserved, but abandoned. She did not visit again. The fourth event was Arthur's 70th birthday dinner in 1920, attended by 18 family members. The number fit comfortably in the small dining room. No one suggested using the larger state rooms. Everyone understood that those spaces belonged to a version of Bagshot Park that no longer existed. 4 events in 41 years. A palace designed for hosting, built with reception rooms and guest wings, and a ballroom sized for 200 dancers, reduced to near total isolation. The silence was not peaceful, it was suffocating. Staff numbers continued falling. By 1925, only 27 people worked at Bagshot Park. The head gardener retired and was not replaced. 2 housemaids left to marry and were not replaced. The under-butler was dismissed for theft, possibly false charges, but Arthur could no longer afford legal proceedings to verify. The cook remained but supervised no kitchen staff, preparing simple meals for Arthur and Louise Margaret, who ate separately in their private sitting rooms. The estate grounds deteriorated visibly. The formal gardens, once maintained to royal standards, became overgrown. The private lake filled with algae. Glass houses for tropical plants were left unheated, and plants died. The stables, built for 20 horses, housed 3 aging carriage horses that were rarely used. The model farm sat empty, its buildings decaying. Inside the house, entropy accelerated. The roof developed leaks in the closed east wing. No one repaired them because no one used those rooms. Water damage spread across ceilings, down walls, into the plasterwork of rooms that had been beautiful once and now quietly rotted. The central heating system, designed to warm the entire building, was operated at minimal capacity. Pipes froze in unused wings during winter. Several burst, flooding rooms that no one discovered for weeks, and Arthur's health declined in step with the estate. The gout became chronic. He developed respiratory problems from living in a partially heated house. His military duties were increasingly ceremonial. He spent most days in his study, a small room on the ground floor that could be kept warm with a single fireplace, reading or staring at paperwork that documented the ongoing financial collapse he could not prevent. Louise Margaret existed somewhere else in the house. Staff reported seeing her rarely. She kept to her private sitting room and bedroom. She still took walks in the woodland, though less frequently as arthritis made walking painful. In 1923, she became seriously ill with pneumonia. She recovered, but grew frailer. By 1925, she seldom left her rooms at all. They had been married 46 years. They lived in opposite wings of a 120-room palace and saw each other perhaps once per week. The distance was architectural and emotional. The house that was supposed to contain Arthur had also contained his marriage, his wife's identity, any possibility of intimacy. The rooms designed to be filled with family had instead isolated everyone inside them. In 1930, Arthur was 80 years old. He had lived at Bagshot Park for 43 years. Victoria had been dead for 29. The palace was collapsing around him, physically and financially. He owed money to suppliers, to staff whose wages were months behind, to the crown for maintenance he could not perform. He could still have asked for release. He could have written to his nephew, King George V, explained the impossibility of his situation. He requested a smaller property or even permission to retire to grace and favor apartments at one of the occupied palaces. George would have agreed. The family understood that Bagshot Park had become unsustainable. Arthur never asked. Perhaps by 80, he no longer remembered that alternatives existed. Perhaps the palace had become so completely his identity that leaving would have felt like self-annihilation. Or perhaps, after spending his entire life as Victoria's favorite son, he could not abandon the monument to her love, even when that monument was crushing him. So, he stayed. And the silence deepened, and the rooms closed one by one, and the palace that was supposed to keep him close to his mother instead kept him close to nothing except the slow work of disappearing. By 1940, only 14 staff remained. Arthur was 90. Louise Margaret was 88. They lived in 6 heated rooms of a 120-room estate that cost more than they possessed to maintain and more than anyone else would pay to acquire. The woodland had advanced to within 50 feet of the house, reclaiming territory Victoria had carefully cleared in 1878. And inside, in rooms no one had entered for decades, dust accumulated on furniture no one would use again, covering the physical remnants of a love that had looked like generosity but functioned as prison. The house remembered everything. The people inside it remembered only how to endure. Chapter 9. The inheritance no one wanted. When Prince Arthur died in January 1942, his children refused to live at Bagshot Park. Arthur died on the 16th of January, exactly 41 years and 6 days after his mother. He was 91 years old. The death certificate listed cardiac failure, but people who saw him in his final months said he simply stopped eating properly, stopped leaving his study, stopped maintaining the pretense that he wanted to continue living inside walls that had defined and confined him for 64 years. Louise Margaret survived him by 14 months. She died in March 1943 at the age of 90. Staff reported that after Arthur's death, she seemed relieved. She spent her final year in relative peace, occupying 3 rooms on the ground floor, tended by 1 nurse and visited weekly by her daughter Victoria Patricia. When she died, her possessions fit into 2 trunks. A princess of Prussia, who had brought royal dowries and inherited family wealth, had been reduced to almost nothing by the cost of maintaining a palace she never wanted. The estate passed to their children, according to standard royal succession. Princess Margaret Victoria, the eldest, was technically first in line to inherit. She was 60 years old, married, living in comfortable circumstances in Sweden. She visited Bagshot Park once after her father's death, toured the decaying wings and the overgrown grounds, and declined the inheritance formally in writing. Her reasoning was documented in a letter to the Crown Estate. "I cannot in conscience accept a property that requires resources beyond reasonable means to maintain. Bagshot Park was my grandmother's creation, not my father's home. It represents an obligation I am unwilling to assume." Prince Arthur Frederick, the middle child, was 59. He had spent his entire adult life in military service abroad, deliberately building a career that kept him away from England and away from Bagshot Park. He declined the inheritance without visiting the property. His letter was briefer. "I respectfully refuse." Princess Victoria Patricia, the youngest at 56, considered accepting. She visited 3 times in the spring of 1942, walking through the locked wings, examining the water damage and structural decay, calculating what restoration would cost. Her accountants estimated that bringing Bagshot Park back to minimally habitable royal standards would require at least £200,000 immediately, with ongoing annual costs of $20,000. But she declined in June 1942. Her letter to the Crown Estate was the most detailed. Bagshot Park is not a home. It is a monument to a kind of love that should never be memorialized. The building is beautiful and ruined. Restoring it would be throwing good money after bad, trying to resurrect something that was broken from the beginning. I will not participate in maintaining my grandmother's mistake. All three children, independently, use the word prison in their private correspondence. Not house, not estate, not palace. Prison. The Crown reclaimed Bagshot Park in July 1942. The property reverted to the Crown Estate with the understanding that it would be evaluated for potential use or sale. World War II was ongoing. The military considered requisitioning the building for administrative offices or hospital use. They inspected the property and rejected it. Bagshot Park was too isolated, too expensive to heat, too Gothic and maze-like for practical military application. The estate sat empty through the war. Windows were boarded against bombing damage. A single caretaker lived in the gate lodge, paid minimal wages to prevent complete vandalism. The main house was locked but not maintained. The roof continued leaking. Pipes burst and flooded rooms, and no one came to repair the damage. The woodland advanced closer, surrounding the building, beginning the process of swallowing it. In 1946, the Crown attempted to sell Bagshot Park. The asking price was £50,000, a fraction of what Victoria had spent building it, and a reflection of how comprehensively it had failed as a desirable property. 3 potential buyers toured the estate. All 3 declined. The house was too large for a private family, too expensive to restore, too deliberately isolated to convert into a school or hotel or sanatorium. The estate remained empty for 7 more years. The Crown reduced the price to £25,000 in 1950. No buyers emerged. The building continued decaying. Local residents reported that children broke into the lower floors, exploring the abandoned palace, creating ghost stories about the forgotten prince who had died there and the cruel queen who had built his cage. By 1953, Bagshot Park had been empty for 11 years. The Crown Estate considered demolition. The building had become a liability, a royal embarrassment, a physical reminder that sometimes the family's grandest gestures were just expensive mistakes. Then, in a development no one had anticipated, the Crown decided to preserve it. Not for historical value or architectural significance, for eventual reuse by a royal family member who might value isolation more than society. Someone who might see Victoria's trap as protection rather than prison. It would take 46 more years to find that person. In the meantime, Bagshot Park sat empty, locked, slowly being consumed by the woodland Victoria had so carefully arranged around it. The windows facing the interior courtyard looked inward at nothing. The guest bedrooms no one wanted remained perfectly positioned to prevent escape. The architecture of control stood intact, waiting for someone else to occupy, to be contained, to discover whether Victoria's design could ever function as something other than suffocation. The children's rejection was the clearest verdict on what Bagshot Park actually was. They had grown up there. They understood the weight of those walls, the way the palace absorbed identity and possibility, the manner in which beauty could be indistinguishable from harm. They had watched their father spend his entire life inside a gift that looked like love and functioned as imprisonment. and they chose freedom. Even if freedom meant rejecting a palace, rejecting royal precedent, rejecting the last physical trace of their grandmother's obsession with keeping her favorite son close. The inheritance no one wanted told the truth Victoria had spent £500,000 trying to hide. Sometimes the cruelest gift is the one you cannot refuse and cannot escape. Chapter 10. The Prince Who Hides There Now. In 1999, the Crown offered Bagshot Park to Prince Edward, and he accepted on one condition: total privacy. Edward was 35 years old, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II. He had married Sophie Rhys-Jones the previous June in a relatively modest ceremony that reflected their shared desire to avoid excessive public attention. They needed a residence. The Crown Estate maintained several properties suitable for junior royals. Bagshot Park, empty since Arthur's children rejected it in 1942 and used only intermittently for storage and minor crown functions, and was available. The estate came with complications. It had been partially renovated in the 1970s, but remained fundamentally the palace Victoria had designed. 120 rooms, 30 bedrooms, Gothic revival turrets, and 260 acres of dense Surrey woodland. Most importantly, it retained the architectural quality that made it simultaneously perfect and problematic: complete isolation. Edward toured the property 3 times before accepting. He walked through the restored state rooms and the wings that remained closed. He studied the interior courtyard, the guest bedrooms facing inward, the positioning of the house deep within the woodland buffer. He understood what Bagshot Park was designed to do, and he decided that in the late 20th century, isolation was no longer a trap. It was a feature. His condition was explicit. The Crown would restore Bagshot Park to full habitability at an estimated cost of £12 million. In exchange, Edward and Sophie would accept no public funding for daily operations, maintain the estate privately, and receive absolute security protection that prevented public access or photography. Bagshot Park would return to what Victoria originally intended: a royal residence no one could see into. The restoration took 2 years. Workers replaced the damaged roof, repaired water, damaged plasterwork, updated heating and electrical systems, restored the formal gardens, cleared decades of accumulated neglect. But they preserved the fundamental architecture. The interior courtyard remained. The guest bedrooms still faced inward, so the woodland buffer was reinforced with additional security measures: cameras, motion sensors, a private road with controlled gates, staff trained to report any attempted public access. Edward and Sophie moved in during 2001. They immediately implemented privacy protocols stricter than any other contemporary royal residence. No media photography allowed, no public tours, no documentation of interior spaces. Staff signed comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Even aerial photography was discouraged through negotiated no-fly zones. The parallel to Victoria's original vision is exact. She built Bagshot Park to keep Arthur close and hidden, protected from public scrutiny and personal autonomy. Edward uses the same isolation to keep the public distant, to create a royal life insulated from media intrusion. The architecture functions identically. Only the direction of control has reversed. Edward and Sophie use approximately 45 of the 120 rooms regularly. They keep guest wings closed, except for family visits. They employ 50 staff, fewer than Victoria's original 100, but sufficient for modern operations. They host private events, family gatherings, small dinner parties that never appear in social columns, because attendees understand that privacy is the fundamental condition of entering Bagshot Park. The woodland remains impenetrable. The formal gardens are maintained but not open to the public. The estate has become what it always threatened to be, a place where royals can exist without being observed, where the weight of public expectation cannot penetrate, where privacy approaches invisibility. The irony is that Edward has found freedom in the place that imprisoned Arthur. Where Arthur experienced Bagshot Park as a cage designed by maternal obsession, Edward experiences it as a refuge from media obsession. The same walls that prevented Arthur from leaving now prevent cameras from entering. The same isolation that suffocated Arthur's autonomy now protects Edward's privacy. But the architecture has not changed. The interior courtyard still reflects windows inward. The guest bedrooms still face away from Surrey horizons. The woodland still surrounds the palace like a buffer between the inhabitants and the world. Bagshot Park still does exactly what Victoria designed it to do: contain, isolate, hide. The difference is that Edward chose this. Arthur never had a choice. Edward sees the isolation as protection. Arthur experienced it as imprisonment. But the walls are the same. The design is unchanged. And the fundamental question Victoria's architecture poses remains unanswered. Is a cage still a cage if the person inside wants to be there? Or does wanting to be contained just mean the trap has finally found the right prisoner? Edward has lived at Bagshot Park for over 20 years now. He and Sophie raised their children there, hosted private moments, built a life deliberately hidden from public view. They have succeeded in making Bagshot Park function as Victoria intended: invisible, unreachable, unknown. Whether this represents freedom or just a more comfortable form of imprisonment is a question only Edward can answer. From outside the woodland, from beyond the security perimeter, from anywhere the public is permitted to observe, Bagshot Park looks exactly as it always has: beautiful, Gothic, and utterly impenetrable. A palace built to hide someone is still hiding someone. Victoria would approve. Chapter 11. What the Walls Remember. Staff who worked at Bagshot Park in the 1980s reported finding rooms that had not been opened since Arthur's death. The Crown Estate conducted a comprehensive inventory in 1984, preparing for potential restoration. Workers opened wings that had been locked for 42 years. They found furniture under dust sheets, exactly as Arthur's staff had left it when closing the unused sections in the early 1900s. Beds were still made, linens yellow with age but undisturbed. Wardrobes contained clothing from the Edwardian era. Dressing tables held silver hairbrushes, perfume bottles, and the small personal items that suggested someone had just stepped out and would return momentarily. They did not return. The rooms waited instead. In the nursery wing, workers found toys from the 1880s. A wooden rocking horse, paint faded but intact. Dolls with porcelain faces, arranged on a shelf. Building blocks scattered across a table as though a child had been interrupted mid-construction and never came back to finish. These were the toys of Arthur's children, now themselves elderly or dead, abandoned when the children grew up and left Bagshot Park as quickly as escape was permitted. In Louise Margaret's private sitting room, workers found journals. Not the formal diaries historians search for, but personal notebooks filled with sketches of woodland plants, pressed flowers, observations about weather and seasonal changes. The entries were not dated. Many pages were blank. The journal suggested a woman who had started documenting her life and then stopped, either because documentation felt pointless or because she learned that privacy was safer than record. The most unsettling discovery was Arthur's study. His desk remained arranged as though he might return at any moment. Military documents filed neatly, personal correspondence organized by year, an unfinished letter dated January 1942, a week before his death, addressed to the War Office about a ceremonial matter that no longer mattered. The letter broke off mid-sentence. Arthur had set down his pen and never picked it up again. The room felt frozen, preserved not deliberately, but through neglect. 42 years of dust-covered surfaces that had once been meticulously maintained. The fireplace was cold, ashes from the last fire still in the grate. Books remained open on side tables, marking pages Arthur would never finish reading. The windows, facing the interior courtyard, as Victoria had specified, looked inward at the same view Arthur had seen for 64 years. Workers reported feeling uncomfortable in the study, not because of anything supernatural, but because of the weight of evidence that a life had simply stopped there. The room was a time capsule of futility, documenting the daily existence of a man who had nowhere to go and nothing to escape toward. The paranormal claims began circulating in the 1990s. Local residents reported seeing lights in windows of the long abandoned upper floors. Security staff mentioned strange sounds during night patrols, footsteps in empty corridors, doors that seemed to open on their own. The stories accumulated the Gothic atmosphere Bagshot Park had always possessed. The rational explanations are simpler. Lights were likely security personnel or maintenance workers accessing closed sections. Sounds in a large, aging building are expected. Wood settling, wind through poorly sealed windows, small animals inhabiting unused spaces. Doors opened because latches had corroded or frames had shifted over decades of neglect. But rational explanations do not account for the feeling multiple staff members reported, the sense that Bagshot Park resists occupation, that the building remembers being Victoria's trap and wants to continue functioning as such, that the walls themselves retain memory of the purpose they were designed to serve. Preservation experts evaluating the estate before Edward's arrival noted that Bagshot Park had deteriorated unevenly. Rooms Victoria had designated for family use showed relatively minor damage. Rooms she had designed for guests or social functions had suffered extensively. The architecture seemed to decay selectively, maintaining the spaces Victoria cared about while abandoning those she had included only for appearance. This is likely coincidence. The family rooms were on the ground floor, better protected from roof leaks. The guest wings were higher, more exposed to water damage, but the pattern supported a feeling staff could not quite articulate. That Bagshot Park knew what it was for and rejected uses that contradicted Victoria's original intention. When Edward and Sophie moved in during 2001, restoration was incomplete in several wings. They chose to keep those areas closed, preserving the sense of the house containing more than it showed. Staff occasionally entered the closed sections for maintenance. They reported that some rooms still held artifacts from Arthur's era, items too historically insignificant to preserve, but too personal to discard. A leather-bound book in one guest bedroom contained pressed flowers with annotations in a feminine hand, possibly Louise Margaret's. A child's christening gown in a trunk, initials embroidered but faded beyond legibility. Military medals in a velvet case, unnamed, belonging to Arthur or one of his officers. These objects accumulated in closed rooms, becoming unintentional memorials to lives that Bagshot Park had contained and consumed. The walls remember because the walls were designed to remember. Victoria built Bagshot Park to be permanent, to outlast her, to continue the work of keeping Arthur close, even after death made physical presence impossible. The architecture was always intended to have memory, to function as a monument to her love disguised as control. Whether the building succeeds at this depends on belief. If Bagshot Park is simply stone and wood and glass, then it remembers nothing. It is inert material shaped by human decisions, decaying according to natural processes. But if buildings can absorb the intentions of their creators, can retain purpose beyond their immediate function, then Bagshot Park remembers everything. It remembers being built as a trap. It remembers containing Arthur until death. It remembers being rejected by his children. It remembers waiting 57 years for someone else to occupy. And now it remembers Edward and Sophie, who use its isolation willingly, who find refuge in walls designed for imprisonment. The palace has come full circle. It hides someone again. Whether hiding is freedom or captivity is no longer a question the architecture needs to answer. The walls remember, they do not judge. Chapter 12. The Cost of Being Loved. Queen Victoria believed she gave Prince Arthur everything, and in a sense, she did. A palace, security, eternal closeness. She spent more than £500,000 in today's currency building Bagshot Park. She designed it personally, specifying architectural details down to the positioning of windows and the orientation of guest bedrooms. She visited 17 times in 6 years, claiming space in Arthur's home with the confidence of someone who had never acknowledged boundaries. She believed every action demonstrated love. And perhaps it did. Perhaps obsessive attention and architectural control were the only ways Victoria knew to express affection after Albert's death destroyed her capacity for healthy attachment. Perhaps Arthur, born into this pathology, never developed the language to recognize that love should not feel like suffocation. But intention does not determine outcome. Victoria intended generosity and created a prison. She intended closeness and created isolation. She intended to give Arthur everything, and instead gave him a palace he could not afford, could not escape, and could not transform into anything except the physical manifestation of his mother's need. The cost of being loved this way is erasure. Arthur spent his entire life as Victoria's favorite, the child she chose above all others to receive her concentrated emotional intensity. In return, he ceased to exist as a separate person. His desires, his military ambitions, his marriage, his autonomy, all subordinated to her need to keep him accessible. By the time Victoria died, Arthur was 51 and had no identity outside being her son. The palace was his legacy, and the palace was a cage. Louise Margaret paid her own cost. She arrived as a confident Prussian princess and disappeared into architectural silence, her life reduced to long walks in woodland that offered the only escape available. She bore children in a house controlled by her mother-in-law. She aged into invisibility. The historical record barely acknowledges she existed. This is what happens to people who live inside someone else's obsession. They vanish. The children understood the cost clearly enough to refuse inheritance. All three declined Bagshot Park, despite royal precedent suggesting they should accept. They recognized that accepting the palace meant accepting everything it represented: Victoria's pathological love, Arthur's failed autonomy, the weight of maintaining a monument to maternal obsession. They chose poverty over possession. They chose freedom over legacy. Bagshot Park stands now as Edward and Sophie's residence, beautiful and hidden and unchanged in its fundamental architecture. The isolation that imprisoned Arthur protects Edward. The same walls serve opposite purposes, but the building has not transformed. It has simply found occupants whose needs align with what Victoria designed it to do. This raises the legacy question that haunts every examination of Bagshot Park. Is it worse to be forgotten by those who should love you, or to be so thoroughly possessed that you cease to exist separately from their need? Victoria's other children received less attention and more freedom. They pursued careers, traveled, built lives outside her immediate control. They were loved less intensely and lived more fully. Arthur received her concentrated devotion and lost himself completely. The question is, which constitutes the greater harm, neglect or possession? There is no comfortable answer. Both cause damage. Both leave people struggling to construct identity from the fragments permitted to exist. But possession masquerades as love more successfully than neglect. It is harder to recognize imprisonment when the cage is beautiful and the jailer claims every restriction proves devotion. Bagshot Park cost Victoria £500,000 to build. It cost Arthur his autonomy, his marriage, his identity, and 64 years of life lived inside walls designed to prevent escape. It cost Louise Margaret her public existence and private agency. It cost the children the family home they should have inherited and wanted to reject. These costs are calculable in money and time and documented suffering. But the deeper cost is philosophical. Bagshot Park demonstrates that the most dangerous gifts are the ones that cannot be refused or escaped, that look like generosity while functioning as control, that transform love into architecture and make imprisonment beautiful. The palace remains invisible because it was never meant to be seen. Visibility would require acknowledging what it actually is, a monument to maternal obsession, a memorial to love that suffocates, a Gothic masterpiece built on the foundation of one person's refusal to let another person be free. Victoria believed she gave Arthur everything. The truth is simpler and more tragic. She gave him a palace indistinguishable from a prison, and then she made certain he could never leave. This is what love looked like when filtered through her grief and need and inability to imagine that possession and affection might be different things. Bagshot Park endures. It has survived 137 years since completion. It has outlasted Victoria, Arthur, Louise Margaret, and the children who refused it. It will outlast Edward and Sophie. The building will stand long after everyone who understood its original purpose has died. And perhaps that is the final cost. The palace will remain beautiful and mysterious and isolated, its true nature forgotten over time, its history reduced to architectural appreciation rather than psychological horror. Future occupants may find it charming. Historians may praise Victoria's Gothic vision. The truth that it was built as a trap may fade into romantic legend, but the walls remember. They remember being designed to contain. They remember Victoria's specifications, ensuring that windows face inward and escape is architecturally impossible. They remember Arthur walking past locked doors every morning for 64 years. They remember Louise Margaret standing at the woodland boundary, looking toward freedom she could see but never reach. The cost of being loved the way Victoria loved Arthur is this: you become invisible even to yourself, absorbed so completely into someone else's need that your own existence becomes theoretical. You live in a palace and die in a cage. You receive everything and have nothing. you are cherished and destroyed simultaneously. And the building that monuments this remains standing, beautiful and Gothic and hidden in Surrey woodland. I'm waiting for the next person who mistakes isolation for protection, who confuses containment with love, who believes that walls designed to imprison might somehow, this time, function differently. Victoria built Bagshot Park to keep Arthur close. She succeeded. The palace is her victory and his defeat. And the cost of that victory continues accumulating room by room, generation by generation, as long as the walls stand and remember what they were built to do.